Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Summer Blockbusters of 2018. In this video, I will count down the 10 summer blockbusters I saw this year. So at the start of the summer, I made a list of 10 movies I was going to see, and after having seen all 10, I'm here to count them down from my least favorite to my favorite. So to be clear, I have only seen 10 summer blockbusters this year. If a movie isn't on the list, it doesn't necessarily mean it's worse than the movie that's on the list. It simply means I haven't seen it. So I elected to see only movies that looked appealing to me, so films like The First Purge, Skyscraper, The Equalizer 2, The Meg, Mamma Mia 2, The Darkest Minds, or The Spy Who Dumped Me. I didn't see any of these as they did not look all that appealing to me, and I didn't want to waste my time on them. However, typically, I would say that this list is only for big budget blockbusters, not indie films that happen to come out over the summer. However, this year that's not necessarily the case, because there is one film this year that is questionable in its blockbuster status, as it definitely isn't big budget and is arguably more of an indie film, so I almost didn't include it, but it did get a wide release, and it was in the top 5 highest grossing films of the US the weekend it was released, so I decided to include it anyway, because I wanted to see this film, so I figured why waste my time seeing another movie I didn't really want to see. I had actually originally intended to see Ocean's 8, but I was too busy when the film came out, and unfortunately I did not get around to seeing it before it left theaters, so I had to discount it. So instead I saw this other borderline indie film, which I'll get to later. Also, this year tested what's considered a summer movie as well, as I included Avengers Infinity War despite having been released in late April, because it is generally being considered a summer blockbuster by the community at large, even though April is stretching it a bit. But I decided not to include movies released slightly before it, like A Quiet Place, which I really loved, because I don't want to stretch that definition too far. So, this is the 4th year in a row I'm doing one of these videos, and I have to be honest, I seriously considered not doing it this year, because in order to do it, I had to ensure to see 10 movies over the summer, which for me is winter because I live in New Zealand, but neither here nor there. Point is, it's not cheap, and historically I have seen a lot of bad movies that I wouldn't have seen otherwise, and I felt wasted my time. However, last year I noted that it was the best year for summer blockbusters, as I didn't have to see any movies that were that bad. However, this year was even better. Not only did I not have to see any movies that were as bad as last year, the movies were all of pretty high quality. In fact, I almost called this the year of the 7, because as you'll shortly see, I gave almost all the blockbusters I saw this year a 7 out of 10, which is a pretty good score. But more than that, my top 3 blockbusters this year I thought were all fantastic and are all close contenders for some of my favorite movies of all time. And that most certainly is the first year that ever happened. In any event, let's go ahead and jump into my top 10. We'll start with my number 10, and that's least favorite summer blockbuster I saw this year, and that is Sicario: Day of the Soldado. I must start by saying that I did not like the first Sicario, so it was kind of silly of me to see the sequel and expect to like it. I know the first Sicario movie is celebrated and a lot of people loved it. In fact, I will be talking about that film soon in my Patreon-only video series where I cover what I believe are the most overrated films of all time. But the trailers for this film sold me, and the fact there was a different director and a different creative team behind the film than the first one had me convinced that this could be different enough that I might like it. And indeed, I did prefer this to the first film, but I still didn't think that highly of it. It didn't have the same problems as the first one, which was lack of narrative structure and having a Mary Sue as the villain. I'm referring to the Benicio del Toro's character, but it had different issues, where this film introduced a lot of interesting story elements, but they ultimately went nowhere, and introduced an interesting teenage character whom you think will end up affecting Del Toro's character, or them forming some sort of bond, but nothing really happened. I mean, they kind of sort of did, but they didn't really take it anywhere. And they had cool action sequences, but ultimately, like, they didn't like lead to any great storytelling. They introduced a dynamic of a cartel war, and they didn't really follow up on it. So this film, to me, felt like all build-up with no payoff, and ultimately it was a bit too slow and kind of boring at times. That being said, it still had some great acting, some great character moments, and some great action scenes. So my rating for Sicario Day of the Soldado out of 10 is a 5 average. But that is my lowest rating film this year, and the only film I would say is not quite good and just average. Next, we take a leap into quality, as the rest of the films I'd say are actually quite good. So let's move on to my number 9, which is Ant-Man and the Wasp. So this was another solid entry into the MCU. It was engaging and funny, and the humor and chemistry between characters worked in the action scenes with them shrinking and growing things big all of a sudden really worked and made for some really entertaining action sequences. However, I would say I like the first Ant-Man better, and this film, despite being really engaging, did little to set itself apart from the rest of the MCU movies, and this thus kind of blends together with everything. It's a very fun and enjoyable movie, but nothing special, so my rating for Ant-Man and the Wasp out of 10 is a 7, very good. So next we move on to my number 8, which is Solo, a Star Wars story. It's funny that Star Wars, rather than abortion, has become the one topic that no one wants to touch with a 10-foot pole, as just evoking the name instantly seems to ignite conflict. But I will say, although I never asked for nor wanted to see a Han Solo's origin movie, the one we got wasn't bad. It wasn't great, but it wasn't bad. I thought the story was interesting enough. I was invested in Han's character journey. I thought the ensemble of characters were used very well, and there were some pretty suspenseful, well-executed action sequences. Woody Harrelson was great in this movie, and I thought Emilia Clarke was pretty good as well, and I absolutely loved Chewbacca in this film. He definitely stole the show for me. And yes, Danny Glover as Lando was fine too. But ultimately, it was just a decent but forgettable action film that I probably wouldn't think that much about afterwards had it not have the Star Wars name attached to it. So my rating for Solo, a Star Wars story out of 10 is a 7, very good. So moving on to my number 7, which is Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. Now, I actually like this movie better than the first one. Part of the reason I may have enjoyed this film so much was the fact I wasn't expecting much of it based on the reviews it was getting, combined with my general disinterest in the franchise overall. And while I enjoyed the first Jurassic World movie, every time I think of that film, I think of that pointless, gratuitous death of the assistant who was just looking after her boss's nephews. I mean, come on, why give her such a horrible, exaggerated death? She did not deserve to die like that. That always really bothers me. Like, it disturbs me, and not in a good way. But in this film, everyone who gets an over-the-top gruesome death totally deserves it, and I really appreciate that. And this film surprised me by going in a direction I was not expecting, and I found really interesting. I heard some other critics bash this film for having a horrible twist, but I'm going to have to disagree very strongly. I really liked the twist, and in contrary to their insistence that it was totally pointless, I thought it added a lot of texture to the film, and thus I think they went beyond a simple flick about dinosaurs killing people, which to me is always the biggest hurdle for these Jurassic Park franchise films. So before I said the Jurassic World was the best Jurassic Park sequel, but now I'm going to have to say this film is by far the best Jurassic Park sequel. That, of course, doesn't include the first one. But it is what it is. So my rating for Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom out of 10 is a 7, very good. So next we'll move on to my number 6, which is Black Klansman. And yes, this is the film I alluded to earlier that's kind of more of an indie film, but it did get a wide release. I saw it advertised all over town, and it was in the top 5 box office films for the weekend it was released in the US, so I'm going to count it. Anyway, this was a pretty good movie. It had some very strong characters, some very good acting. I really cared about these characters, and I could get behind them. And the quirky humor in this film really worked and blended well into the dramatic scenes. And of course, it also made some very powerful, very poignant social commentary that I thought was very important. I thought this film did a great job conveying it. The problem comes in with the plot, as it seemed to meander a lot and not hold my interest as much as I wanted it to, and the ending wasn't as satisfying as I would have cared for it to be, and it relied on a gimmick that I have mixed feelings about. As on one hand, it was very powerful and actually had me in tears, but on the other hand was heavy-handed and felt like it was holding the audience's hand instead of trusting them to be smart enough to figure it out for themselves. But ultimately, pretty good film, so my rating for Black Klansman out of 10 is a 7, very good. So then we come to my number 5, which is Tag. This was an unexpected little comedy about 4 childhood friends playing the same game of tag for over 20 years, well until their adulthood, and hijinks ensue. This was very loosely based off of a true story, and I thought the film did an amazing job of getting you invested and to relate to the characters involved, where you were behind their very childish goal of tagging their friend who has never been tagged before. I'm typically not a huge fan of many modern day comedies. For example, I can't stand Will Ferrell in anything he's in, who thankfully wasn't in this movie. Instead, we had Jeremy Renner and John Hamm, who are always good. But more than that, I found this wasn't too silly or over the top as most modern comedies tend to be, and didn't rely too much on toilet humor. Don't get me wrong, it still had its moments where its silliness was a bit over the top, but it was grounded in some very relatable characters, and the film did an amazing job of getting you to feel the camaraderie that exists between this group of long-term friends, and I would actually describe this silly comedy as quite touching. Whereas when most comedies try to be touching, it just comes off as cliched and forced and a bit stereotypical, where here it felt natural and was much more effective. So my rating for Tag out of 10 is a 7, very good. So then we get into my number 4, which is Avengers Infinity War. I was really impressed with how well they managed to incorporate an absolutely ridiculous amount of characters and give them all their due, and never make any of them feel flat or underused, as that was my biggest fear going into this film. And the job they did juggling so many different characters and storylines was incredibly impressive. On top of that, seeing some of our beloved characters interact with other characters they never met before was handled so well and made for some immensely entertaining and unexpected chemistry that combined with some amazing action sequences, of course. However, that being said, where the film felt a bit flat to me was the main villain, Thanos, whom I was not as crazy about as many critics seem to be, as again he came off as a Mary Sue to me. Or more to the point, he seems to present the Superman problem, where a character is so powerful and undefeatable it loses dynamic and it loses interesting stakes. The film tried its hardest, it tried its damnedest to flesh out this villain and make him relatable, but in my opinion, it failed, and I didn't really buy his motivations. Now, you may say, well, that's unfair to say he's undefeatable because he could be defeated in the next film. Which leads me to the other problem I had with this film, is that it was not self-contained enough. And it relied too much on a cliffhanger, which makes make no mistake, the ending of this film was a cliffhanger. It was far too open-ended for my taste, which really disappointed me. But as I said, I still was very impressed with the movie. I had a lot of amazing character interactions and action scenes that made the film totally worthwhile, but not self-contained enough, and with a villain that was a bit too powerful. So my rating for Avengers Infinity War out of 10 is a 7. Very good. So now we get to my top 3, and here is another giant leap forward to the films that completely blew me away. I was surprised there were so many this year. Each of these films I thought at one stage would be my number 1, and I will probably consider them all some of my favorite films of all time. So let's start with my number 3, which is Deadpool 2. I heard varying opinions on this, but I actually liked this more than the first one, as the first one was a tad bit too generic and simple in its plot. And although this one does drag a bit in the beginning, I overall found the payoffs in this film were much more huge. In fact, I think I would count this film among some of my favorite comedies of all time, right up there with Airplane and The Naked Gun. Now, this isn't exactly a parody like those films, as it does have a somewhat serious plot that's actually good, but that's just a nice bonus in my opinion. The comedic moments in this film were absolutely amazing, such as The Vanisher. I mean, every time they even mentioned The Vanisher, I burst out into laughter. And the music they played during the big Juggernaut fight scene at the end had me rolling around in laughter. The dialogue was just more quippy and interesting. These characters were more interesting. Loved Domino and Cable. And Deadpool himself was just a lot funnier in this film. And this film, bar none, has the best post-credit scene in any film ever. Just my opinion. And that is a bold statement, but I stand firmly behind it. This is a comedy classic in my opinion, so my rating for Deadpool 2 out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. So next we'll get into my number 2, another movie that absolutely blew me away. That is The Incredibles 2. I've heard many critics say that this wasn't as good as the first one, but seeing how I didn't even like the first one, that is a statement I couldn't possibly disagree with more. In fact, I almost didn't see this film because, similarly to Sicario, I didn't really like the first one and felt it was incredibly overrated, pun intended. But unlike Sicario, I found it was a great decision to see the second one, even though I didn't really care for the first. In fact, I was completely blown away by this movie and would say in my mind it is a very strong contender for best superhero movie of all time, and I would put it right up there with Wall-E and Inside Out as one of the best Pixar films of all time. And if you know me, you know that is a bold statement indeed. I can't wait to see this movie for a second time. It was so suspenseful, so impactful, so fun, and at times hilariously funny, and also had great, well-developed character stories that blew the first one way out of the water. Even though this was a cartoon family with superpowers, they felt like realistic, tangible characters, and I was invested in each and every one of these character stories as they played out. And yes, I do have to mention this has the best animated fight scene of all time, Jack versus a raccoon. That was simply amazing. I could not love it more. And the visuals in this movie were absolutely superb, like the scene where Elastigirl encountered the screen slaver in an apartment building was a legitimately suspenseful and very intense action scene for any film, let alone an animated one. I could gush on about this film for hours. It was simply amazing. So my rating for The Incredibles 2 out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. So I was really sure for a while that Incredibles 2 would be my number 1 summer blockbuster movie this year, but to my everlasting surprise, I saw a film I liked even better that completely blew me away, and that I definitely count amongst my favorite movies of all time, and that is my number 1 summer blockbuster movie of 2018, Mission Impossible Fallout. I said of the last Mission Impossible entry, Rogue Nation, which I really liked, that that was my favorite Mission Impossible movie since the first one. Well, Fallout is my favorite Mission Impossible movie, period. Not only that, but I would even be as bold to say that Mission Impossible Fallout is among my favorite action movies of all time, right up there with films like Die Hard and The Terminator, and that is not hyperbole or exaggeration. I love this film that much. In fact, I would say it is by far the best spy thriller type film I've ever seen. Better than any James Bond or Jason Bourne film. Although, if you know me, I've never been a huge fan of either franchise, so that's not as bold of a statement, but there it is. I've never before experienced a film so thrilling, so engaging, so utterly beautifully constructed. Not only is the film one super intense stunt, one super intense heavy action piece after another, the characters are extremely fleshed out and interesting, are the driving component of the film. If you didn't care that much about the characters as you do, the action sequences wouldn't mean as much as they do, regardless of how death-defying the stunts are. And on top of that, the plot is complex and thought-provoking and always engaging, making you think, and never comes off as a generic, mindless action movie. Nor is it ever over-convoluted and has its head up its own ass like many spy thrillers tend to do. It may be one of the most perfectly constructed action films I have ever seen. Even though Tom Cruise's Ethan Hunt is the heart of the film, it also features a rich ensemble of complex characters who are believable and have fleshed out motivations in their own right. Like in Rogue Nation, the standout character for me was Rebecca Ferguson's Esla Faust, who again was simply amazing, and the chemistry that she had with Tom Cruise was totally on point. And of course, we had well-timed comic relief moments helped a lot by Simon Pegg, and an ending that had me on the edge of my seat more so than any other film I ever remember seeing. This is a damn near perfect action movie, so my rating for Mission Impossible Fallout out of 10 is a 10, the best. Now, I said before that I rarely give out 10s to a movie, and if I do, then that means that it's instantly in my top 50 favorite movies of all time, and that most assuredly is the case here with this film, which is absolutely amazing and my number one favorite summer blockbuster of 2018. So that's it for my top 10 summer blockbusters of 2018. I'll be back at the end of the year to count down my top 10 favorite movies of 2018. In the meantime, you can check out my channel as I do many videos on other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Better Call Saul, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.